So I'm David A. Dalrymple, sometimes known as Davidad. I'm a research affiliate with the Synthetic Neurobiology group at the MIT Media Lab, and I'm on leave from the biophysics program at Harvard to do Project Nemaload. So the idea is that the nematode worm is the simplest brain out there in nature. It has only 302 neurons, and we mapped it out actually back in the 70s. That we know where all the connections are between all the neurons, but we still don't know how it thinks. And the reason for that is when you map out the connections, you're doing that in a slice, in slices of dead brain. And they're not doing anything. So you know where they are, but you don't know what they do. And we don't have the technology to image all of the activity that's happening in a living brain until very recently. And so these new technologies like optogenetics have just come online in the past couple of years that allow us to observe what's going on in a living nervous system, at least a very simple one, like the nematode. And so my goal is to use those technologies to produce an accurate computer model of how the nervous system interacts with its environment. And so I'll create a virtual worm in a virtual environment and see if it acts like the real worm does in its real environment. Well, I think it'll make a pretty cool app. You can download a worm and apply various stimuli and see how it behaves. I don't think there's going to be that much that we can learn about its behavior that we didn't already know, since most of the behaviors are pretty simple. But it will tell us something about how nature has organized the nervous system to perform those behaviors. Why this neuron goes there and why this connection and not that one, which is currently quite mysterious. We have some ideas about what some of the neurons are for, especially the sensory neurons and the motor neurons, where you can see exactly what they're wired up to. But we don't really know how it makes its decisions of where to go to avoid or to find the things that it wants. And I think it'll be a milestone when we can say that we've fully analyzed and emulated a biological nervous system, even if it's the simplest one out there. It's sort of a step transition of going from 0 to 1. And then it'll just be a matter of scaling the technologies and the mathematics and the algorithms to do zebrafish, to do ants, to do bees, and ultimately mice and monkeys and maybe humans, if this all goes according to plan. Effectively the first mind upload, to upload the simplest mind that we could, and sort of start small, walk before we can run, and to develop some of the tools, the basic approaches, the criteria for determining what constitutes a successful upload, and to answer some of the questions about what level of abstraction is necessary to properly reflect the overall behavior. I'm hopeful that we only need to understand what's going on at a sort of neuron level of abstraction, although there are many people who argue that we need to see individual neurotransmitter vesicles or even individual quantum state transitions, which would of course be much more challenging. So if I can show that at least in the nematode, looking at individual neurons or subcellular compartments is sufficient, that's strong evidence that it will remain the case in higher organisms. I like what Randall's doing. I mean, he's the only person who's really keeping track of everyone in the uploading field, insofar as it is even a field. And it's certainly valuable to have someone who actually knows what's going on in all these different corners, and it's great how he brings people together. There's certainly people that I've talked to as a result of Randall that I wouldn't have encountered otherwise in different universities and whatnot. And I think it's the whole brain emulation roadmap needs an update, but it's better to have one than none. So yeah, Randall's great. Well, what's different is we have 9 orders of magnitude more neurons than worms. We have a lot of complex learned behaviors, whereas the worms really only have one learned behavior, and it's quite simple, which is thermotaxis. And the challenges of getting data out of a brain that's stuck inside of a skull while it's still alive are much greater at an engineering level, because in a nematode worm we have this very convenient fact that it's transparent and microscopic. And so all we need to do to image it is put it under a microscope. And it's a fancy microscope, but still, in order to get data out of a human, we'll need a different type of approach. Maybe something involving injectable circuitry, or perhaps just a very advanced electromagnetic field measurement system of some kind that we haven't really invented yet. I started thinking about this project seriously a little over 2 years ago, and at the time I was an AI researcher at MIT, and since then I've left MIT, spent a year at Harvard studying neuroscience. I think the problem of understanding and copying what's going on in a biological system like the brain is actually much easier than the problem of fixing when things go wrong. And that's one of the reasons that I'm focused on this side of things rather than on anti-aging. Because I think there's a whole other side to the problem of repair, which is creating interventions that actually change the state of the body. And if all we have to do is observe and analyze, that seems like a more tractable situation. Then again, if we have to observe and analyze the brain, which is the most complex system in nature, and we only have to intervene in some sort of minor cellular processes, that may be another story. So a diversity of approaches is very important. Yes, so I actually work with Ed Boyden. He's officially my sponsor at MIT. And Optogenetics was his idea back in 2006 to use light-activated ion channels, originally from algae and other microbes, to make neurons controllable by light. And that allows us to perform experiments that ordinarily would require really challenging positioning of electrodes or micropipettes with just lasers. And there's also this more recent development of optogenetics where we can not just control what's going on in neurons with light, but also observe. And this has been pioneered by the work of Janelia Farm at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. They've produced a fluorescent protein which is sensitive to the calcium concentration, a primary marker of neural activity. So it glows brighter the more active the neuron is. But calcium is actually a very important ion in a whole host of biological processes. And in most cells, the concentration of calcium is kept extraordinarily low, much lower than it is ordinarily in the aqueous environment that life started in. And it's used as a signaling ion. And so where there's more calcium present than 10 to the minus 8 or something concentration, that's a signal that something is going on in the cell. And when we're talking about nerve cells, it's a signal of neural activation. And in fact, the calcium concentration is the direct trigger for neurotransmitter release. So the voltage of the neuron, which is what you typically think of as its important variable, only impacts neurotransmitter release, which is what you think of as its output, via the calcium response. It's an exciting time because we have a lot of new tools that will allow us to access new data. And that new data will allow us to build new things and have new experiences. I agree with Kurzweil's timescales, except that I think they're massively overconfident. To predict that Singularity will happen in a specific year, I think is totally unjustified. But if I had to pick a median, it would be about the same. I think the Singularity is possible. I think it's likely it's going to happen soon, and I think it probably is going to be hugely beneficial. I think in the AI community, and especially in the AGI community, there's a lot of unnecessary focus on utility functions as a fundamental driver of behavior. I think that our human value system is not arbitrary, and it isn't the top of the mental hierarchy. I think human values, in many ways, evolved because of their effectiveness in problem solving, and that if we develop a superintelligence, it's bound to find itself evolving in the same directions. So I'm not worried about choosing a random intelligence out of a hat and finding that its value system is radically different, because if you choose a random intelligence out of a hat, it's not actually going to be very intelligent. I think there's a lot more correlation between ethics and intelligence than we really are able to understand at this stage. But I think the process of evolution shows us that whatever system is most able to sort of adapt to various environments and to develop diversity is ultimately going to be dominant. And we'll go through many cycles of different sorts of paradigms. Like right now we're in the human paradigm, and ultimately we'll move beyond the human paradigm, but it doesn't mean that the fundamental virtues that evolution has instilled are going away. Those are pretty much taken for given in the way that our universe works. That's a good question. I mean, I do tend to think more about computational intelligence than about enhancing biology. I think there's certainly going to be a lot of people who are going to be totally unwilling to give up their current physical embodiment, and I respect that. I think there's going to be a lot of options available for enhancement, and I think a lot of more people are probably going to take the path that's known as gradual uploading, where you replace different parts of the brain with neuroprostheses over a long period of time, rather than going for the one-shot scan and copy. So I think it's going to be important, because a lot of people are not going to be able to make the leap that they can identify with a machine that's sort of an other, just because it sort of captured all of their neural state. And the problem with gradual uploading is that it involves technologies that are more advanced, I think, than what we're going to need for what I call non-destructive uploading, where all you're doing is analyzing. But that remains to be seen. We still don't really know what any of the technologies that would be used for human uploading would turn out to be. And although I think non-destructive uploading will come first, I think gradual uploading is going to be the most popular option. I've read a couple of excerpts. I've read a couple excerpts of Egan's work. I think he's got a very good conceptual understanding of how these sorts of things could play out. There's a lot of theories that people from Kurzweil to David Deutsch and others have advanced about the important phase transitions in the history of the universe. From not life to life is the one that everyone seems to agree on. Other people point to humans, or to writing, to the printing press, that sort of thing. I suspect the internet will be recognized as the beginning of a phase transition, in much the way that the printing press was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because it brings down the cost of retrieving information. And I think the ultimate conclusion of this next phase transition is going to be computational intelligence, that we will not only exist in carbon-based bodies that are entirely separate from each other, but sort of transition into a civilization that identifies at more levels of abstraction. And that's not the final stage. There's going to be more interesting phase transitions to come. Hard to say what those will be now. But I do think that this next one of getting to the singularity is at least as important as civilization itself, and possibly as important as human life. Cycles of enhancement and improvement crop up all over nature. I guess the most obvious cycles are death and rebirth. I think this is just another phase in the evolutionary process. It's the next step. From the outside, if all of the human bodies get replaced by machines, it might look like a sort of a mass extinction event. But mass extinction events are how the stagnant, dominant paradigms are cleared away to make room for the next stage of evolution, and we're all glad that the dinosaurs were cleared away. And so I think when we transition to the next phase, it's going to be a more complex state. It's going to be more diverse. It's going to be more interesting. There's going to be more value. There's going to be more emotion, I would say, and there's just going to be more of everything, because it leads to greater and greater abundance. And will ultimately spread, not just on this planet, but to other planets and throughout the universe. And being in a human body makes it very difficult to survive outside the planet. So this is really important for that as well. Well, I think in science fiction there's always a need to depict the alien as, well, alien, sort of disgusting in a way, because they're not us. But in a deep way, the upload process it's an assurance that the next phase of evolution will be us, because it'll be based on the information that comprises our minds and our culture and our civilization. And so there's no need to depict it as an alien invasion, because it's really just enhancing our own capabilities. And although we look at robots and computers as being fairly limited and ugly and primitive today, there's going to be so much variety in what we will be able to produce ultimately that it'll surpass it'll achieve and surpass what we can do in our current forms. Virtual space is an interesting thing, because it almost reduces the value or the importance of the things that, as a civilization, we like to pretend that we don't value. And those things, you get all those things for free. You really have to worry about, when you're living in virtual space, is how you're going to get enough energy. And there's no way around that problem. The singularity doesn't mean an end to struggle, and it doesn't mean an end to conflict. You still have to negotiate with your fellows to decide how to allocate resources and to discover and exploit new resources. But we'll be able to focus more on those problems and less on problems of enjoyment and pleasure once we have a virtual space to satisfy all of that within. I think the identity of a mind, what makes us who we are, is a pattern of functionality. Buckminster Fuller has this great metaphor of a slippable knot tied in a nylon rope. And you can slide the knot from one end of the rope to the other, and it's the same knot, it's the same pattern, even though you're moving it around. And now, if you imagine splicing a manila rope to the end of the nylon rope, and you slide the knot down over that boundary, and now you have the same knot, you have the same pattern, but it's made of completely different stuff. But we think of it as the same knot because it's the same pattern, and it's maintained this continuity as it's crossed that transition. And I think that's the sense of identity that we need to consider when we think about uploading. I think that when we consider many copies of the same person, if they're operating independently, they shouldn't be considered as all being the same person. But it's conceivable, if you're started from the same pattern, that you could have multiple copies operating somewhat independently, but maintaining some shared state and coordinating and acting as a larger agent. And I think that's going to be a powerful paradigm for the future of organizations. The ability to share consciousness across individuals that really is denied to us with the low bandwidth forms of communication like talking and drawing pictures, also known as writing. And when we consider identity, we do have to be a little bit more flexible, because we no longer have these sharp boundaries in the future of mucous membranes. And that enables a lot of things. It also raises a lot of questions, from politics to ethics to economics. And I think we really need to start figuring those out before human uploading arrives. And part of my goal with the Nemaload project is to get people to take the concept of uploading more seriously, so that we'll start to have those debates and figure out those problems of what a society looks like when identity is no longer so clear-cut. How did I meet Ray Kurzweil? Actually, this is going to raise more questions than it answers, but I met him at the White House back in 2000, actually on New Year's Eve, crossing over into the new millennium. And the way that happened is we were both presenters at this sort of technology expo that the Smithsonian and the White House had put together for the Millennium celebrations. And Ray was there demonstrating the possibility of a translating telephone that would, in real time, change your speech into another language. And I was there demonstrating the possibility that in the new millennium, children will be able to build robots. Using Lego Mindstorms, which is pretty new at the time. So I demonstrated some of my Lego Mindstorms things and gave a little speech about robotics, and he talked about the translating telephone, and he was impressed with my speech, and I was impressed with his. So we met up at the reception, and he offered me a job on the spot, which my mom, who was standing behind me, I was 9 at the time. Actually, no, I was 8, hadn't turned 9 yet. And my mom said, "No, I'm afraid you cannot hire my 8-year-old son." But I've stayed in touch, worked for him for a couple of summers, and I've been sort of inundated with Singularity memes from a very young age.